Hey, it's Jose Galison of No Way Jose. You can find me on No Way Jose YouTube channel. You can also find me on all the major podcatchers on Odyssey as well. Today, my guest is Ace, or Anarchist on Twitter. I'm continuing my Anarchist Handbook series. We'll be covering Benjamin Tucker. As always, give me money. Patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. I'm a big fan of money. I like that stuff, so give me more of it. Go check out TopLobsta. He makes kickass merch. There's No Way Jose merch there if you are interested in that. There's a bunch of other merch too. Pretty much, go there. There's something you'll like. I guarantee it. With that, let's go ahead and bring on Ace. What's up, dude?
Thanks so much, Jose. This has been a blast.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, this is the second time I've had you on. I've been on other shows with you before, but second time having you on my channel. But I'm still gonna have you intro yourself again, because you never know who's this is their first time popping in, and absolutely, you are someone worth getting to know. So
thank you.
Go ahead and intro yourself real quick.
Yeah, of course. I am Ace_Archist on Twitter. I engage in a lot of fruitless debates on Twitter. Some of them are good, but most of them fruitless. But they can be fun. And I'm also the co-host of the Slurp Gang podcast, and that's about it.
Yeah, not to go on a side. That is your thing. You're known for debating on Twitter, which anyone knows. Yes. Twitter, it's not really a platform set up for debate. So it's like I've been renowned for not debating. Like I will.
That's smart.
Yeah, I will fuck with people. But there it's like I feel like you either got to go one extreme or the other with Twitter. You either have to be ready for the long haul and to go go and quote tweet threads like crazy, or just give them a no and walk away. Like it's one of the two. You know what I mean? Like no and not explain yourself.
Right. Yeah. It's like that Ayn Rand quote. One side is right and one side is wrong, but the middle is always evil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That is how you engage on Twitter. You have to go one extreme or the other, and that's the only thing. You have to figure out which one you are.
Yeah, that's right.
And very few are your route, because that's a whole lot more intensive.
Yeah.
So I want to start off with I want to know how Benjamin Tucker has affected your thinking. That's the first question I want to ask.
Oh gosh, I think he probably has affected my thinking the most in the idea that the language we use and the terminology we use isn't always quite as clear. So with Tucker and a lot of these individuals, anarchists of the past, you'll notice that they use words very differently from how most libertarians will colloquially use them right now in today's time. For example, one we'll be touching on today is socialism, right? Socialism is this idea, and it's not that libertarians are wrong when they're talking about socialism, but it's that this word has had different connotations throughout time. And if you don't understand that, it's going to lead to a lot of confusion when we're looking into the past of these past thinkers.
Yeah, no, that is. I've said this many times. The most important thing, really, like if you actually want to have a good, honest discussion, is defining terms, and that's one thing that socialists and capitalists are renowned for. Is I'd say 90+% of the time they're usually describing the same phenomenon using different terms and arguing at each other, and just no one really has any interest in understanding the other. They just want to be right, and it's like, you're both right, you idiots.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah 100%.
So, exactly. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, and you'll see it too online. You'll see someone will be like, well, that's not capitalism, and then someone, well, that is capitalism. It's like, okay, well, whether or not the mouth sound you're using is whatever thing, this is what I'm describing.
Right.
So let's operate with that. Like, sure, your definition may be different. Who cares? This is my definition. Words are subjective.
That's right. Yes.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, the intention, the meaning behind it is given to it by the person. So
that's right.
That's why it matters to figure out what they have to say about it. So let's move on. Who the fuck is Benjamin Tucker?
Well, Benjamin Tucker is one of the early American anarchists. He's often regarded as one of the first, not the first, but one of the first individualist anarchists in American history, and he's probably the most prominent out of all of them. So there were some earlier ones like Josiah Warren, who Tucker is actually very inspired by. But Tucker is probably most famously known for starting the newspaper Liberty, aptly named. And I will get into that a little bit probably later in the show, but that's his main claim to fame. He also translated a bunch of other works from other countries. For example, he translated Proudhon's What is Property? A lot of Proudhon's work, the reason that a bunch of thinkers from America read Proudhon was because of Benjamin Tucker. And he also translated the very first copy into English of The Ego and Its Own by Stirner. So he is responsible for that mainly, and that's a huge thing in like anarchist, especially in American anarchism. And it we'll touch on that a little bit later, but it also very much influenced Benjamin Tucker's thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't know all that. That's actually a lot. Yeah, I don't recall if I've read Proudhon yet in here. I haven't before. That's one of the great things about reading through the Anarchist Handbook is a lot of stuff that I'm like, just now reading. Because I mean, that's one pitfall I think a lot of us anarchists fall into is we find our tribe and we stick with it and we don't really operate outside of it. I mean, I'd kind of like dabbled in like the pretty much I've mostly read ANCAP stuff, but then I've read Konkin and I've read Stirner as well. Those were like the two, but now this is like very much opening my eyes. That's one thing, like we'll touch on it more, once again, we've touched on this, that I have, especially through this, and I've already kind of had a little bit of inclination that this was the case before, that a lot of these anarchists are describing similar things. Yes, there might be minutia that's different, but a lot of it's very much the same.
Yes.
Like, so, I mean, minor differences here and there. I'm not saying every single one's exactly the same, but it is, I don't know. So we get caught up in like, well, you're this ideology and you're that ideology, but it's like, what are you saying? Like you really got to sit down and be like, what is this person saying? What's that person saying? And you'll learn to find out that you guys tend to have a lot in common. So
yes, absolutely.
And this isn't me saying let's have bottom unity or whatever.
Right.
Honestly, I find unity arguments insanely annoying because it really is like it's the old what's this Frederick Douglass quote. It's like, I'll unite with anyone to do good and no one do bad. It's really that simple. So it's like we get so caught up in like who we're uniting with. It's like, well, just like maybe just when you don't agree with them, don't agree with them. It's really that simple.
We don't have to be bound by this pact, life or death thing, right? It's like, no, I'll agree when I agree. I won't when I won't. Simple as that.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, sure. If you're saying unity, and I mean, I feel like a lot of people when they hear unity implies some sort of like, I will, stick with you when I don't agree with you or whatever. But it's like, maybe don't.
Right. Yeah.
So, anyways, tell me a little bit about Tucker's ideology, just roughly. Like, I know we said he's a socialist, but if we could delve into a little bit more.
Yeah, we should. I think we should define that right off the bat, right? Because when Tucker says he's a socialist, when most people think that, because I personally experienced this when I've recommended Tucker to people, is they'll look a little bio up of him and they'll see, oh, he calls himself a socialist. I don't want to read that, and it's like, no. The thing is that socialism back in Tucker's time, back in like the 1800s specifically, it was a much more broad, generalized term rather than the state ownership of the means of production. That term still existed within a subset of socialism, but that was not its own thing. It was not the encompassing framework of socialism. Socialism back then essentially just dealt with what was known as the social question, and that dealt with labor. Like, how should we view the laborer in relation to other social forces in society? And also, socialism. Another take on socialism was also the idea that it was an anti-state take, which was that socialism just meant peaceful civil society should be in charge and not the state. So it was actually a bulwark in opposition to the state and not like how we would define it today, which was the state ownership of the means of production. Now, this did get bastardized by Marx, of course, and Tucker even takes an issue with that. But I think it's important to note that Tucker was not some state socialist, and he wasn't even a socialist how we would regard them today at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, literally in the intro, the little Michael Mouse's intro in this, he says, like, one line that stuck out to me that I underlined was, socialism did not necessarily have the contemporary meaning of government control. So, I mean, and I feel like a lot of people know that too when it comes to socialism. There's like, and that's kind of what this whole essay is breaking down. All right, let's get into the essay now. Ace, would you like to tell me how this came about being created, this essay in the first place? Because I found the story to be kind of interesting.
Sure. Well, the whole point of this was Tucker was getting consistently frustrated at certain movements and certain inter-socialist movements within the space that he referred to himself as a socialist, right? So there were these kind of forces, or these people, these groups that would always fight and squabble over who was correct, right? Which is one of the things you get into when you read Tucker, especially in this essay, is that you realize there's nothing new under the sun and that these fights have been going on forever. So Tucker essentially made this. He made it in 1886. It was published in, and it kind of just goes over the fact that there are two main strains of socialism that he sees, and there's a bunch of people in the middle who he sees as just not far enough. They are just not where they need to be, and they're not consistent.
I would equate those within our circles as kind of like the minarchy-anarchy divide, sort of, because I mean they both are and I talked about this a little bit in my episode with Dave, where like if you're going to be a consistent minarchist, it's kind of like you got to get to the point of, well, we need like a one world government, and there's a lot of that goes on here that we'll get into. But that's the same idea with how he breaks down of the authority and liberty. It's the same thing with the socialism. And it's like, I feel like you see so many of these parallels between like our thinking, their thinking. Yes. And it's almost like it's so close. It's hard to not almost like impose, like being like, well, they're borderline damn near the same thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. This has been going on for so long. It's
But yeah, it's very much that. There were like, he's saying that like in order, like basically what we want is this. And, in order to get this, you have to either go this route or that route. And they're both two entirely different extremes.
Right, and he even mentions in here how like the two sides of this both want the same thing in some sense, or they both want the same outcome, I should say, but they're diametrically opposed on how to get there. And there's a huge amount we could say on that in relation to current libertarian politic. Right. So
I did want to say this is a quote that came in there. I thought it was like I was reading it. I just once again it was another ones that like you can kind of just completely just put our current situation just like the libertarian movement in general and kind of impose on this. It says probably no agitation has ever attained the magnitude, either the number of its recruits or the area of its influence, which has been attained by modern socialism. And what I'm saying is just swap that out with like libertarianism, anarchy, whatever you want. And at the same time, been so little understood and so misunderstood, not only by the hostile and the indifferent, but by the friendly and even by the great mass of the adherents themselves. Which you can just kind of going into that, how there are all these people in the middle who it's like, it's kind of the whole like not a real libertarian. Like you got to pick one. Like if right, and it's kind of like the minarchist anarchist. Like if you're gonna be a minarchist, like okay, well then you need to be pushing for a one world government. Like that's the only way that if you're going to create a monopoly on government to enforce liberty, that's the only way you're going to go about it. Right. And then obviously it has its own issues, but we're not debating that. He's just pointing out the two different strains.
Right. So, it's like and this is a lot about like when movements grow, right? Mm-hmm. It kind of becomes like this game of telephone where like the actual meaning of what the original movement was gets lost over time. The more adherents like join in. There's a lot to say about that too. But I think he nails the first part of it because that's the opening of the essay. Yeah.
Which I mean to touch on, like I just did the Emma Goldman one with Thad, and it fucking like the whole point of that essay is the minority, the majority, and that really plays to this concept here and how, like, yes, once you have an idea, once the minorities have pushed forth this idea and kind of, tread the path, then it kind of then becomes taken over by the majority that kind of pervert its meaning and don't understand it to the extent that it's supposed to be understood, which he kind of touches on in here, how he even is a little bit more snobby than even, I'd say Emma is in his, where he says, he basically says that only people would really even truly understand the ideology were the thought leaders themselves. So I was like, that's a bit extreme, but we get the point he's getting at.
Right. He as compared to like, the middle ground, like mass types, but yeah.
Okay. So now the next part comes, he starts talking about the commonality between the two kinds, which we already touched on a little bit. I did want to drop another quote real quick because it really applies, and he kind of talks about this is a little bit of their commonality. He says socialism was in the air, and the time was ripe, and the conditions favorable for the appearance of this new school of thought. Which I don't know about you. I mean, I do feel that same way in modern times. Not specifically about socialism. I mean, you can kind of swap out the words because when he's saying socialism, he's imbuing his own meaning, which we talked about earlier. Where
that's like, right. Yeah, it's a much more generalized meaning.
Yeah, because we immediately hear, most people in a colloquial sense hear socialism, and we immediately jump to state socialism and like what he's talking about, which is very different from what he's advocating. So so I don't know if you want to touch on the commonality. You're a little bit more big brain, so this kind of comes into the economic side of things. So I can kind of crudely. It's kind of labor theory of value, and how it's the true value of something is by its labor. But I'll let you go. You're better at this kind of stuff than I am. So
Sure. Well, he's addressing the commonality, like how the time was essentially right for this idea, and how because this is right after the Industrial Revolution, or it's not right. I shouldn't say right after. It's after the Industrial Revolution, and this is essentially when there's been this fomentation of like labor conditions have dropped, like or not. They've risen over time, right? It take it longer after they've risen, but there was a time right after the Industrial Revolution where they could, like, labor conditions were really not great, and then it created this idea that laborers are just being treated very unfairly. And Tucker and many other individualist anarchists would obviously say, right, there's an anarchist free market solution to this. But the time was right for this mass movement of laborers to critique what they saw as unfair treatment by the powers that be.
Yeah, which I mean, to kind of get the economic science of things, is the labor theory of value, in which they're backing it up. Like, basically, cost is determined by labor, is what he's getting at.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, which obviously we'd have disagreements with. But if you're going to take this line of thought, it does have the two logical conclusions that he presents in this essay. That if we're going to have that, and this is kind of where we segue into where he starts defining them. So the first one he'll be starting is state socialism, and I mean, in this one, state socialism, they attempt to end, like, they identify, I guess I kind of skimmed over, they identify the problem being monopolies. Like, that's what causes this issue with, this extra profit that's over what just labor, which, I mean, I know we're not going to go too much into critiques, but if we're accepting this logic, like, this is where we're at. Go ahead. Sorry, you had something to say.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I do think later on, though, Tucker is very nuanced with that, because he doesn't take exactly the same tact Marx would take, especially not in his prescriptions on what to do, right? So I think that they're,
Yeah, no, it gets a little bit, it does, that's what I'm saying with terms and what they mean. You kind of got to be careful, because, some of the stuff he said, it's like, I mean, it's not necessarily entirely Austrian economics as we would perceive it.
No,
but
it's not.
It's there is some stuff where you're like, okay, I can see where you're coming from there, especially coming from an Austrian perspective. God, what was I gonna say? Shit, I had a point. Monopolies. So with monopolies, so now we get into state socialism, and state socialism being their method of correcting the problem is to have one monopoly, which once again, the minarchy-anarchy divide, it's kind of, it's pretty obvious. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think he nails it. Like, I think Tucker's not the first one to come up with this, but I think this is his real claim to fame, which is his theory of monopoly. And we'll get into like the four monopolies later on in the essay. But his idea is like the problem is monopoly, and the state socialists are going to create the thing that they hate the most, right? So that they're shooting themselves in the foot and everywhere else possible. So I think his critique nails it. I don't know how much you want me to get into it right now, or if you want me to save it for later.
We can take time. We're breaking this sucker down. I will say, though, for those who haven't read it yet, I feel like he spends far more time describing anarchism than he does this, but I do feel like this is a necessary prerequisite before you get into it, because he's comparing and contrasting the two. I do want to get into it. And then also kind of like you can tell it's very yin and yang. So even when he's going into the anarchism side, it is kind of implied like, well, this is the opposite of the other. So, and there's a little, I don't know if you call it a poem at the end. I want to read for this. Because I do think it's worth it.
The end of it, this is great. It's just like bullet point after bullet point, just bang,
and I'm just gonna straight up just read that, because it's almost like borderline like a poem. It's kind of really beautiful. So
it's almost like something Rothbard would write. It's almost like this very punchy.
So you said you want to touch a little bit more on this one.
I think the one I'm going to touch on the most is when we get to the four monopolies, because I feel like that's when he really breaks it down. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, we kind of really touched on most of it. I mean, obviously, he breaks it down more. He kind of goes into how state socialism, by logic, like logically speaking, will essentially encompass all. Because he does go into how, like, Marx said that it would be like, oh, well, no, it wouldn't. Like they had some sort of loose, way of limiting it, but he was like, no, if you're going to be logical, then it's going to encompass all things. Like, it will encompass religion, morality. Like, he even said it will become a state religion, which, I mean, that speaks to a lot of like stuff we see today. So how dare you question science?
How instead of the worker being, being in a company or a firm that is like quasi-monopolistic now, they'll be in an inescapable monopoly with the state, because everything they do, if they want to work, they have to go through the state's monopoly to do so. And I think, and this was, Austrians would make that point, of course, today, or libertarians or anarchists, but it's just really cool that you can read this and be like, yeah, he got it. He understood, right? He nailed it.
Yeah, which I do want to emphasize, because it was kind of a point he made, and how the thought leaders, because he was kind of getting at how like these people are the ones who really understood it, and he did focus on a lot. The thought leaders for this side was Marx mostly. He did make some emphasis about how they were filtered through certain thinkers. Like he emphasized how socialism, state socialism, was filtered through like the church. But like mostly he's talking about this. And here we get in the part where we're talking about he's kind of talking about Warren or Josiah Warren and Proudhon, and how their theories have what their theories are, because they were the two major thinkers in the other side, the yang to Marx's yin.
That's right.
So, which I mean, he even talks about too how it's well known that Marx got a lot of his economic principles from Proudhon. So yeah. But even then, he did then concede that like he made it a unique enough of its own that's not really like an issue. It wasn't like he like ripped him off necessarily. So no such thing as original idea. But let's go ahead and get into anarchism, which he in this is kind of talks about how this is the exact opposite. Like now, instead of creating one monopoly, it's anarchy. So essentially, us being Austrians, we know that as you loosen up the market, it lowers prices.
That's right.
So if you have a labor theory of value, I mean that's the best way to get it closest to the labor. The cost, if you will, even though I know that gets screwy for us, but that's the best way to get it closest to it from that perspective. So, I don't know if you have
Tucker's whole thing was like socialist ends, but we preface this in the beginning, but socialism is a very much broader context back then. But socialism through free market means essentially was his idea, because he bring even if me and you we would disagree with like the labor theory of value, but his prescriptions for how to fix things are spot on, in my opinion. Like I think he just nails it. Because he's saying that ultimately it's the state's monopoly that essentially causes this problem of like the laborer being, because in some sense, there's truth to this, because we do not live in a free market. The restrictive amount of businesses that there are through like regulatory capture and things like that make it so that the laborer's wages are going to be artificially lower because there's less businesses competing for those wages, right?
Yeah.
And there's a much larger labor market, meaning that the larger labor market is going to drive the wage price down, but the small amount of firms and businesses allowed within this captive market is going to make it so that the wage rates are lower. And I think that's a very good point, like whether you agree with the labor theory of value or not.
Yeah. Well, another thing too that I thought was really interesting is how he pointed out how Marx was flawed in his distinguishing of capital and product, or
yes,
was it capital and product?
It's capital and product.
Yeah, which he kind of was like those are interchangeable. Like one thing becomes capital. You can move it from one hand to the other, and it becomes.
And you have capital creating capital, right? Yes. So you have these like a product could be a piece of capital too. So there's these things that they're not definite, like platonic different states or whatever,
Because that's like I feel like that's the cop out for the state socialists, where they'll be like, that's their way of getting out of this, like a reductio ad absurdum of everything becomes the government. They're like, whoa. Like, you can keep your product, but not the capital, like, or whatever, what I mean? Like, so it's like, but where are we drawing these lines? Like, at what point?
Eventually, when you break it down far enough, you understand that they're just things being plugged into other things, and that's all that is. That's all there is, really, like in production. And it's capital is a part of that system or process.
Which I think how he puts it, he says the only difference is social use, which can change from person to person, or even the same person from situation to situation. So
that's right.
It makes no sense to distinguish, like. Are you going to be like, well, you can have it now as you use it this way? Oh, use it for a different purpose, give it back. It makes no sense.
That's right.
Yeah, yep. But let's go ahead and get into the monopolies, because that's one thing he does point out that there's 4 major monopolies. The first one being money, which I mean, us coming from the Austrian school, that gets our dick hard, and we're like, yeah, damn straight. Like,
So this is probably like when you realize that he was writing this like 100, in the 1880s. It's just like, this is my opinion is Tucker's best work. Like, this is not unique to him. Other theorists before him touched upon this, as he mentions like Proudhon and Warren. But in my opinion, he encapsulates it better than they do. So he talks about money, right? So the four major monopolies which hurt the common man, which is what the socialists of yesteryear were fighting for. The monopoly on money means that you're going to have the state, you're at the behest of the state creating its own interest rates, and essentially just has the potential to essentially just devalue the currency over time. It means that special banks and special interests are going to have a quasi-monopoly on lending and things like that. And it's going to lead to distortions in the market that we won't see for maybe, years, things that are just not apparent to most people, like who see, only the first layer of state intervention. And I think the money monopoly especially is just huge. And as you said, like if you're interested in Austrian economics at all, this really just raises your ears a lot.
Yeah, and I know for me, I mean, this is only going to further people that like give agorism a bad rap of being like a lefty thing, but I don't feel like that what I'm about to say implies it at all. I see so much of like agorism here too, because even within these monopolies, he points out like how to deal with it. Like for example, like with the money one, he's like, well, to start using your own banks. Like he doesn't go in detail, but he's like, I mean, the way that works is like obviously it's going to be illegal. So in order to do it, you're going to have to find ways around the system, and that's kind of what he's getting at too. And so let's move on to the land, though, because that's the next one. I'm sure you have something to say that.
Oh, yeah. So he's talking about, in the land monopoly, he's talking about how the state essentially grants these land titles that are not based on occupancy and use. So Tucker's view of justified property was that a person had to justifiably homestead the property by occupying and using it. Now, this is a mutualist thing, and I have to touch on this because most people will say that, he thought that rent should be, there's this thing where people think Tucker was against like rent, right? And because that's a common mutualist thing. Mm-hmm. He was not against rent from a prescriptive sense. He thought people had a right to rent land, but just that he thought that in an anarchist society without state granted land titles, there would be more affordable homes and more easily available land to homestead without the state, so that rent would de facto go down rather than a de jure ban on rent.
Which he's not wrong.
Yes, I completely agree with them. So basically on his land monopoly, he's talking about like state granted privilege titles. So often what the state would do, and you definitely see this carried over from like feudalism, where the state would conquer a piece of land. They would keep it captive essentially, and then they would sell it off to certain interests, like certain companies would essentially get the land. They would sell land that was never homesteaded previously, right? But they would keep it captive and not allow people to homestead it. So that's really what he's talking about by monopoly on land titles and things like that, especially specifically privileged land titles that do not involve any sort of homesteading.
Yeah, which I mean, I was thinking while you're saying that, it's just funny how much overlap there is between like anarchist socialists and like anarcho-capitalists, because it's like, yes, like basically we're both saying like, hey, this is what we basically are prescribing the same shit. Yes. We just kind of have a different outcome we're looking for to some extent. But the funny thing is, even then our outcome's not necessarily different, because I actually agree with like pretty much everything he says as an outcome. Yeah. Like this is what would happen.
Yeah, and, I agree. Yeah.
Like there would be, the common thing people always say is that like in Kapistan, you could have your socialist commune, and in Socialistan or whatever you want to call it, you would also be able to have your little capitalist area. So, or at least his version of it, because that is the thing. Like, I think we talked on this a little bit earlier, in that you need to be very careful with definitions whenever
you do. Yeah,
because it's like, what do you mean? And it's like, so right here, this whole essay is a perfect example of just the simple word of socialism. Just for us, our kind throws red flags. We're like, whoa, hold the fuck up, buddy. Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
So, and most people aren't going to read an essay and be like, oh, well, that's what you mean. Like, and they're not going to give you the good faith of being like, oh, well, that. But it's kind of like you need to be a little bit smarter. It's kind of like the bell curve thing. Like, it's like the midwits will just immediately assume. But like, you know what I mean? Like, you got the dummies and the geniuses on the other side. It's the same idea,
right. Yeah.
So let's get into the Tariff Monopoly and see what you got for that one.
So the Tariff Monopoly, he's specifically talking about how this hurts laborers by or consumers in general by putting a tariff or a tax on goods from another country, right? So to make the capital goods in your country more more alluring to for people to buy, because if there's an artificial charge on goods from other countries, and he says this obviously hurts laborers, because obviously the products that they're making are being taxed, they're going to have to pay more for the products that they're going to consume, essentially. And if you're an Austrian specifically, that definitely will obviously you should agree with that.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Just once again touches on everything we've said before. The last one is patents, which this is even for our kind is where it gets dicey.
Tucker is one of the best things about Tucker is that he nailed the IP issue like more than 100 years ago. So the idea that I could go into a whole rant about IP, but he's talking about the idea that you can own a concept or an idea is that's the ultimate form of state privilege, right? Because you have to understand that if you make something, right? If I write down something on a piece of paper, I own that paper and I own what I wrote down in some sense, but I don't own a copy of what I wrote down, right? Because that came from someone else's mind, which they own. And that came, even if it's the same thing, the idea that you get to claim ownership over that would imply that you could claim ownership over other people's very minds and the contents of their minds. And the fact that the state can make it so that you're not allowed to copy anything, that actually holds people back, because as a species, we progressed because we saw someone doing something cool and we copied it, right? Mm-hmm. So this is really, from an evolutionary perspective, this is really the whole basis of human evolution and progress throughout time, is that just imagine if the idea is that, well, the first person who made a wheel and now no one else is able to make a wheel. You know what I mean? So
yeah. Although even among state law, usually there's a given period of time. It's like, but why?
But if it's a natural right, why would it expire?
Yeah, exactly. It makes no sense.
Right.
And it's there's no such thing as an original idea. Any person in existence whatsoever, any idea you've never had an original idea. Maybe you could say that I've mixed these components together, but if you drive them to the root, there's no such thing as an original idea. There just isn't. And so it's the same
all idea.
Yeah,
all ideas come from a person's experience, right? We start with experience, and then we sort of build off from there. But I don't want to say everyone has the same experience, but we all have the capacity for the same experience. And some people do have the same experience, and we get the same ideas from our experience. Yeah, and those are also culturally shaped too. Yeah,
and we're mimetic creatures, so we legit art copy. Anyways familiar with Garnowski knows that's a common thing that he goes on. I don't remember the philosopher that it's derived from. But that's his main thing, is the mimetic theory, and how that's and the funny thing is, to dovetail off the mimetic theory, is a common thing of mimetic theory is that the biggest problems exist amongst those that are very, very close. This doesn't really necessarily, I guess, apply entirely to this, but that kind of touches into the whole socialism capitalism thing, in this context, and how there's this minor little difference, one small little economic discrepancy. And we flip the fucking table over, right? I can already tell there will probably be people who maybe not upset, but there will be those who oh, fuck bottom unity. It's well, I'm not saying that, but but they will immediately get all upset that I'm even defending in any way, shape, or form. It's
right, yeah. And okay. I think I've gone through this too, where it's trying to argue definitions is so at a certain point I get it, because I do feel I do like to defend definitions I'm close to, or I feel that are more true than other definitions. But at the end of the day, it's just I think you said this earlier, where it's just sounds coming out of our mouth. So it really matters is the concept, what we mean behind that.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I do understand the usefulness of protecting certain words, because it's it's a daily use thing, and now it's it's easier if you can set within the social norms of this means that. It makes it easier to express ideas. So if you have these loose gray words, but at the end of the day, if you're in a situation where you guys are at odds because of a definition, you shouldn't let sounds or symbols become a barrier of understanding.
That's right.
It makes no sense if you really think about it. But Yeah, let's move on. He starts providing examples and how he, like, for example, the first one he goes into how protection is like a good, and how, like, in this scenario, it would, we would be able to view protection as a good, and essentially it's very capitalist the way he describes it, and that
Yes.
like, we will purchase the products we want, the service wise, or provide it for ourselves, so on and so forth. And then if you have anything to add to that one. If not,
Oh
we'll
yeah,
move
no.
on.
This is what I always laugh at when people try to claim that that Tucker was like this far left wing, like almost commie. I've had communists try to say that Tucker was like quasi communist, and I think that's just insane. Tucker supported, he's not using the same language Rothbard would use, but he's essentially talking about private defense firms and stuff like that, or products, just buying products off the market. So no, he was Tucker was very. Tucker and Rothbard probably agree on 95% of things. Realistically, it's really close. But yeah, he's very like I love just when he's good breaking it down, because it does sound like something you would read from Rothbard. It sounds like, yeah, we would just have an open free market where we would buy for goods or services, or we could provide them for ourselves. And I think right there he's essentially alluding to like something like mutual aid and things like that, or just self-sufficiency. Yeah, no,
a lot of this does read just like almost if Rothbard was like, I'm going to write some shit for some lefties, and it's going to be the same thing, but I'm going to fail around the edges a little bit just to make it, amenable for them.
Yeah, right.
And then one of the next things he goes into, I thought was really interesting. He goes into how the best way, one of the most effective methods of accomplishing their purposes that was quoted there would be like tax resistance. Which I mean, he was saying like an organized one, but even on an individual level, which I'm sure Tucker would agree with, it's, that's kind of in a lot of sense, to go back to agorism, that's what agorism is. And even people who aren't like strictly agorists do agree that like that is the root of the issue. And most of them do agree at some point, we got to be like, well, we're not paying this shit. Like,
right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot you can get from Tucker if you're just on the anarchist spectrum anywhere, really. And that's what I really like about him.
Yeah, he does get interesting where I thought it was weird. He starts getting into religion, and he's kind of saying that they being the socialists kind of are against religion. But I do think you have to view this in the context of that he is saying specifically in the context of the thought leaders. So, and maybe he's saying, I think what he's implying is like, if you take these principles to their furthest conclusion type deal, which I guess I can kind of see that. I mean, me being atheist, I can understand where he's coming from, but he also goes into how, but at the same time, they're not saying we want to make you be non-religious or whatever. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think he's also talking about like the idea of the state enforcement of religion too here. I think he's talking about what you're saying too, but he's also talking about like how in this with the state socialists, right? And they kind of would promulgate this like religion or a certain type of religion. And he's reaffirming that the anarchists believe that you have the right to believe or deny a belief at your will, right? That's his ultimate point. But that part is kind of like the part that sticks out in the essay the most, which is kind of just it's there, but it's I think the rest of the essay is probably a bit better.
But at the same time, I do, just to sit on this for a minute, I do think, I mean, I'm the atheist, so most people know I'm getting it. I do think if you do apply a lot of these principles, they do take it there, especially what he's saying from his perspective of we need to, like if. In a sense, it's kind of the whole like no gods, no masters type thing. Which I mean, I'm not even necessarily saying this as an argument against religion. I'm saying it from his perspective, for his logic, and his whole thing is that it needs to be one or the other. And he's kind of juxtaposing it against state socialism, which he even said that it would have its own state religion. And to this being the opposing one, essentially, he would say there would be, I mean, you would be allowed to have religion, but to apply these principles to their furthest degree, you would have none. Which I get where he's coming from, and I think it actually kind of makes sense. He doesn't really delve into it deeper. It's like one
kind of
paragraph.
Just there and, just kind of there and gone. But it's I completely agree. He's like with state socialism, right? The state socialism would also have to control the church and the schools, right? Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of state socialism, which is they would control these things. So you would have a monopolistic interpretation of both those things, both cultural and religious. So by definition, you would have a monopoly on religion in a state socialist framework as he's describing it. Now let's get on. He starts talking about like competition and all these different things.
One line that I think it's once again the blurring the lines between capitalists and socialists. Competition everywhere and always is what he says. Which, I mean, how can we not get into that? And I do think it's kind of cool how he then applies it to moral competition, which, I mean, coming from, I've talked about egoism before. I did an episode on Stirner with Magnus. That basically is kind of what egoism is, moral competition. It's like you have your own morals, I have my own morals, and we kind of, even then, he applies it even to moral codes and how they would compete amongst each other. And it's, to some extent, it's like the best man wins, which, I mean, I have always thought it was very weird how our kind, a lot of them are very against that, but it's like, well, why do you not apply these to other things? Like, I mean, no one's saying you have to have this, but they get. I know a lot of our kind get very set on like, well, this is objective morality or this is objective this, and it's like, well, wouldn't it just make more sense to have a competition of ideals?
Yeah. As a little side note, it's funny because when he had his paper Liberty, right, that was his newspaper, and to go back to my point where like, there's nothing new under the sun here, especially when you're reading Tucker, is that. The big debate, and this lasted for a very long time in his paper because there'd be editorials, right? Like different. So what Tucker did, what the New Liberty newspaper was it was Liberty Twitter before the internet or Twitter. So you had all these different anarchists writing like little pieces for it and critiquing the other anarchists and saying that they were bullshit, like from the previous paper. So you had, and one of the big disagreements during this time was of egoism or natural law. And it was like, just like there would just be critique after critique of one or the other. And it was like, it's the same thing that's going on still today in the movement. And as a side note with, I don't know if you know this, but Tucker abandoned the natural rights view and later became an egoist because he was inspired by Stirner later in his life. Yeah.
Well, I agree with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then he starts going to more like competition. He goes into education competition. And then he kind of also applies it to marriage and how like government wouldn't be in marriage. So if you decided one day I don't want to be this woman, you don't have a government contract holding you to it. I mean, maybe you would have some sort of like, I mean, I almost said social contract, but I mean, it would be a non-binding like verbal thing between you. I mean, I know we could probably say you could set up some sort of thing, although I mean, I'm not super good with contract law. I feel
you could attach money. You could attach some money to it or something for damages. I don't know.
Yeah. Which I mean, it is one of those things that's like, why? I mean, look at people when it comes to marriage and how much people's lives get fucked up over that. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, I get too. In another sense, people get like caught up in like, well, like there can be issues if someone doesn't want to take care of their own or whatever. But there are ways to solve those problems. And I mean, we're not going to go too deep into theory with that because that's a
whole nother.
I did once again, and this kind of was something he touched on at the beginning. And he kind of goes into, he says, I will simply call attention to the fact that it is an ideal utterly inconsistent with that of those communists who falsely call themselves anarchists while at the same time advocating a regime of anarchism fully as despotic as that of the state socialists themselves. And that kind of touches on the point you had at the beginning, how you have these people in the middle who don't really even understand shit. Which, I mean, we touched on the bell curve. Those are the fucking midwits. Those are the people who don't really understand anything. They're just... They kind of vaguely had some concepts. Not everyone's the thinking man like me or you are. Like, not that I'm some genius. I jokingly refer to myself as a retard who reads books. But I mean, that is a genius by modern day standards.
Right.
So, and when you're talking about ideology, especially a flashy one, which was socialism at the time, that's kind of what he's getting at. How these people, the majority, to put in Emma Goldman's terms, kind of fuck it up to where you're like. They kind of put a bad name on it. He actually kind of casts a little bit of stones at the Haywood Market people here too, because I guess they. I mean, I don't know enough of the details. You may know more than I do, but it sounds like he was implying that they were actually political advocates, and he was kind of shitting on them for involving themselves in that way. So
I don't think Tucker endorsed the Haymarket affair at all.
Yeah, but even then, I think he was implying that they had like political, they endorsed political candidates and stuff, which he was shitting on them. Kind of the whole modern day, like you're a statist type thing. Which,
right. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know who they were endorsing, but like, I mean, I don't know. He was kind of the extreme. He was the Conkin in a sense of that time.
Yeah. Yeah. He absolutely was. Yes.
And he was kind of like, look at these idiots making us look stupid. Although I think he does actually kind of concede a little bit that like, hey, the way they went out in a sense kind of. Sort of cast a good light, but
and also talking about the also talking about the communist thing, Tucker was just anti-communist through and through. Like he despised them. So I think that's also something important to know. Just and also just because someone calls themselves a socialist, you shouldn't just think that they're just some tanky or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. One quote I wanted to read, and I guess I'll give you a chance to riff off it, and then I want to read the Ernest Lezine. I call it a blurb. I don't even know what you would call it. It's borderline a poem, whatever.
Yeah.
I want to read that, and then we'll have like final thoughts at that point. But this one I want to read because once again, this struck me so much as like very, very much in alignment with like agorism. Essentially, is the anarchists believe in liberty both as an end and means, and are hostile to anything to antagonize it. Because throughout this essay, he does point out how, like, say with like the money monopoly, he said, we'll create your own banks, or like he had kind of prescriptions of like, well, do this, do that. And they kind of were like, well, disregard the law to some extent, So this is how we do this. And this is straight up a line. I wish I could remember it exactly from Conkin, where he says basically the same exact thing. Like your ends and your means need to align, essentially.
Yes.
So, which, I mean, obviously it's a big dispute among our kind right now. It's because a lot of and I understand the arguments for and against. I'm not even necessarily saying, I'm just more trying to show his perspective and how it aligns with ours. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that one before I read the poem or whatever.
No, yeah, I think that's right in general, right? This is like if you sacrifice your means, the end goal will, in some sense, almost not be as fruitful. Right. Yeah. Or it'll feel like cheap in some way, or it might not even turn out the way that you wanted it to because you avoided those means to get there. It might turn out completely differently than you maybe intentioned. So it's very. I think you made a good point how it's like these are the same arguments, and I think that's a common through line throughout this article. You're like, oh yeah, I recognize that. You know, so,
exactly. That's what all this was like. Oh, that's that. Oh, that's that. You're like, we're just using different terms. Right. There are some stuff that are noticeably different and not just in a terms one. For example, like the underlying economic principle. But and I've talked about this before and other things. I think sometimes you need to, I'm not saying, obviously would be a logical fallacy to say this necessarily means it's true, but whenever you have a conclusion that can be reached by multiple lines of logic from, this different foundations of logic, it kind of you should raise your eyebrows and be like, there might be something here. You should pay attention to
it at the very least. Yeah.
Yes, which, I mean, I've said that about other things as well, where it's like, and this has been a noticeable thing within the liberty movement at large, where there have been certain ideas as of late that have been kind of, sort of, a lot of people have been coming to them. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're true, but I do think it means you should take notice. At the very least, there's something that needs to be grappled with. So, but I'm going to go ahead and read the poem. And then after that, we'll kind of do like final thoughts, what you think of it. It's a little bit long, so I feel kind of weird keeping here, but I feel like it's necessary.
Oh, it's great. I love it.
It off. So there are two socialisms. One is communistic, the other soliditarian. One is dictatorial, the other libertarian. One is metaphysical, the other positive. One is dogmatic, the other scientific. One is emotional, the other reflective. One is destructive, the other constructive. Both are in pursuit of the greatest possible welfare for all. One aims to establish happiness for all, the other to enable each to be happy in his own way. The first regards the state as a society sui generis of an especial essence, the product of a sort of divine right outside of and above all society, with special rights and able to exact special obediences. The second considers the state as an association like any other, generally managed worse than others. The first proclaims the sovereignty of the state. The second recognizes no sort of sovereign. One wishes all monopolies to be held by the state. The other wishes the abolition of all monopolies. One wishes the governed class to become the governing class. The other wishes the disappearance of classes. Both declare that the existing state of things cannot last. The first considers revolutions as the indispensable agent of evolutions. The second teaches that repression alone turns evolutions into revolution. The first has faith in a cataclysm. The second knows that social progress will result from the free play of individual efforts. Both understand that we are entering upon a new historic phase. One wishes that there should be none but proletaires. The other wishes that there should be no more proletaires. The first wishes to take everything from everybody. The second wishes to leave each in possession of its own. The one wishes to expropriate everybody. The other wishes everybody to be proprietor. The first says, do as the government wishes. The second says, do as you wish yourself. The former threatens with despotism. The latter promises liberty. The former makes the citizen the subject of the state. The latter makes the state the employee of the citizen. One proclaims that labor pains will be necessary to the birth of a new world. The other declares that real progress will not cause suffering to anyone. The first has confidence in social war. The other believes only in the works of peace. One aspires to command, to regulate, to legislate. The other wishes to attain the minimum of command, of regulation, of legislation. One would be followed by the most atrocious of reactions. The other opens unlimited horizons to progress. The first will fail, the other will succeed. Both desire equality, one by lowering heads that are too high, the other by raising heads that are too low. One sees equality under a common yoke. The other will secure equality and complete liberty. One is intolerant, the other tolerant. One frightens, the other reassures. The first wishes to instruct everybody. The second wishes to enable everybody to instruct himself. The first wishes to support everybody. The second wishes to enable everybody to support himself. One says the land to the state, the mind to the state, the tool to the state, the product to the state. The other says the land to the cultivator, the mind to the miner, the tool to the laborer, the product to the producer. There are only these two socialisms. One is the infancy of socialism, the other is its manhood. One is already the past, the other is the future. One will give place to the other. Today, each of us must choose for the one or the other of these two socialisms, or else confess that he's not a socialist. Which I like that last little dig there. Like, if you're in the middle, you're not a real socialist.
Right. It's like, it's like that Ayn Rand quote, there's right and there's wrong, but the middle is always evil type thing,
Yeah. Which, I mean, there was multiple ones of that, too. I kind of wish I'd brought them up earlier, because there are a few good quotable ones where he says it's that exactly just that. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that poem, because I know it's long, but it's like there's so many great.
It's long. I think he covers everything. He essentially sums up the entire everything previously that he wrote in the article in that little poem right there. So I don't really have too much more to add other than what I've already said. But I generally do like how he ends it, like with a bullet point, like just punch after punch.
Okay, and there's nothing else you want to hit on in the essay while we're at it? Because
I think I would just say the four monopolies I think are like this is his best work by far, and all of Tucker's other work essentially like kind of dovetails back into the four monopolies. He talks about it over time, and I feel like he's like his prescriptions and his conclusions from those four monopolies are just spot on. I think they're completely correct. And I know some like maybe right libertarians would, because whenever you talk about like things like rent, right, or land monopoly, libertarians get a little uneasy. But I do think he's right in the sense that, look, if there was not a monopoly on money and credit, and if there's not a monopoly on land specifically, in the sense that the state did not, encompass a lot of land and then tell people they couldn't homestead it and stuff like that, I do think that there would be a lot less rent, because there'd be much more people would be able to homestead. And at the very least, the rent prices would drop dramatically. So, Go ahead.
Right, my bad. I was going to touch on, too, because I was just kind of thinking while I was reading that, too, is a common trope of the left is like the egalitarianism. And I do find it funny that, like, he is actually still maintaining that perspective to some extent, to where the goal is sort of egalitarianism, equity. But he understands the best way to achieve that is through this, which is kind of funny because, I mean, it's kind of the I've talked to him before with like people always talk about principled or pragmatic, and I'm like, well, they're kind of one and the same. Generally pragmatic is just some nonsense people say when they want to do some shit that's not principled.
Right, exactly.
And that's the same thing with egalitarianism, where people will say egalitarianism, but it's like, yeah, but the end result is of what you're prescribing to get your egalitarianism is not egalitarianism. Like if you want egalitarianism, the best way is through anarchy. Like even through our in Capistan, like as us being like ANCAPs or market anarchists, I know you like to go by. I'm more agorist, whatever. Just very similar. Our end goal, or what we would ideally like for things to be, as would essentially, it wouldn't be 100% egalitarian. There would be differences, but it would be the most attainable form of egalitarianism that human beings could possibly attain.
And we're egalitarians in the sense that we think that each person is their own sovereign, right? Yes. So like you could say that we're egalitarians in that sense. And with Tucker and a lot of like the left market anarchists too, that they talk about, in the individualist anarchists certainly, which is that their whole thing is that a free market will lead to more people getting closer to that ideal of egalitarianism, as you were just saying. So, and you're just saying, right, it's popular to like kind of like crap on egalitarianism, and I'm not going to I'm not going to get into that now, but I'm certainly going to say that there were thinkers who kind of thought differently, but they still had the same means as you do. So I feel like not that people who like are against egalitarianism are wrong, but I definitely think that people should take a look at some of the other thinkers who thought differently but still had the same means as you, because I think there's something there.
Yeah, for sure. With that, you want to go and drop your plugs, and I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. You can find me.
I do want to say real quick. Sorry, I didn't mean to fuck you up.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
But you were one of the first names when I realized I want to do this that came to mind. So because I knew for you, you're a Tucker fan, you're a Spooner fan. So I was like one of those. For those who don't know, I'm going to get Reed to do Spooner. So which seems to be a little off, but I've said multiple times. I'm really trying to get people who exude these people. And I know there are other people, like I know there's a few names that come to mind we think of Spooner. I also want to do something unique. And for some reason, I don't know why, what it is about me. I mean, this is very subjective, but for me, I felt like he exuded it. You exude Tucker, Magnus exudes Sterner, fucking Dave exudes Rothbard. So, I mean, I'm trying to stick with that the best I can. I mean, obviously it's my subjective interpretation, but it's my art I'm creating. Goddamn.
Yeah, it's your show. It's your show.
But yeah, no, I don't know. I guess I was just trying to describe that because, and I'm also trying my best too in this series to have people who are not necessarily critiquing, but presenting their take. And that'll be hard for me too as I get to more commies because it's like if I don't agree. But yeah, because I mean, I'm just trying to present these ideas with as little bias as possible. Although I'm going to bring bias, it's unavoidable. So, but go ahead, go with your plugs. My bad.
Oh yeah. Oh no, that was great. You can find me on Twitter at ace_archist, and you can find me there arguing with people nonstop when I should really be doing other things with my time. But and then you can find me, and then you can also hear me on the Slurp Gang podcast, which I co-host, and you can find that on any podcatcher pretty much. And I just want to say, Jose, thank you so much for inviting me on.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, no, like I said, not to fillet you more, but you were one of the first ones that came to mind.
Thank you.
For me, I got the No Way Jose YouTube channel. I'm also on the major podcatchers. I'm on Odyssey. If you want to hit me up on Twitter at GalisanJose. I do like money. I am a capitalist, or by Tucker's standards, I guess in some senses I'm a socialist. Either way, I like money. Patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And with that, we are done. Thank you so much, Ace.
Thank you.
Ooh,